And here we have the other half, if I can say that, of the lady we've already heard from this morning. And so it's wonderful to have a couple speaking to us on the same morning. We don't often get that. Michael Burdett is the postdoctoral fellow in religion, science and technology at Wycliffe Hall, which is a college in Oxford. There he's a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, and he's also a visiting fellow at St Andrews. And I noticed his wife is based at St Andrews, so I think we won't ask how often the visits are. I don't know if you know the geography in this country. St Andrews is about as far from Oxford as you can get. Well, it's way up in Scotland. So this is a fascinating team we have here to speak to us. So you've got the rest of Michael's bio in your pack there, but I wanted to particularly mention this book that just came out, which I haven't had the privilege yet of reading, Eschatology and the Technological Future, 2015, just come out, is that right, Michael?
In the last 6 months.
In the last 6 months. And is it on our bookstall, or? It is on the bookstall. So
if you're wealthy, you can buy it.
If you're wealthy, you can buy it. One of those. Okay, well, I'm sure that it's going to be discounted anyway. Yeah, so Dr. Burnett's part of this interdisciplinary team working on human origins. We've met through Adam and Eve. We get together. That's the link. So he's doing a whole project on Adam and Eve names, that kind of thing. But today he's going to speak to us on enhancement, human enhancement, and how much should we enhance the humans of the future. So thanks very much.
Can you all hear me sufficiently? Excellent. Well, you shouldn't feel so bad for me. All of my life is not spent on a train between St Andrews and Oxford. I actually spent most of my time in St Andrews because I'm a research fellow. All I require is an armchair rather than a laboratory such as my wife. So, a bit of a caveat, I think, before I start. I am a Christian theologian, so most of my perspective, this isn't an apology, as it were, but necessarily just a point of perspective and context. And I'll try to broaden this out a bit further, but when I'm addressing the theological issues, I will be doing so from within my own tradition. Well, it is no secret that our world has become irrevocably transformed by technology. Lights radiating from our cities adorn satellite pictures and speak of the dramatic changes we have wrought to the Earth's landscape. But these technological changes are not just external to us. Some of the most radical changes in the last century have been directed towards us. This is most visible in the field of medicine. We turn technology on ourselves and we use prescription drugs and other technological therapies to intentionally change, alter, and transform ourselves. I mean, where would modern medicine be today without technology? Where would brain science be without magnetic resonance imaging? Or diabetes without insulin pumps? Or the deaf without cochlear implants? But with such far-ranging advances in medical technology comes an equally difficult set of ethical issues. Just because we can create such technologies and transform the human body doesn't mean we ought to in each instance. So in this presentation, I will outline some of the ethical issues that arise with the rapid advancement of bioengineering and the ways that certain Christian thinkers have dealt with them. However, these difficult ethical issues, and particularly the possibility of genetic engineering being used for enhancement, have led to an eruption of sophisticated ideologies. So we can no longer just content ourselves with the ethics of bioengineering to understand what is at stake here. Rather, we must come to grips, I think, with a kind of tacit pseudo-religion ideology that seeks to go beyond genetic engineering and advocates the unfettered use of human enhancement. I'll be addressing transhumanism. I'll define this a bit later in the presentation once we've addressed the theological, or the ethical issues, as it were. So in addition to addressing some of the ethical issues, I also want to address a core theological issue that arises when Christians dialogue with transhumanism. Namely, what vision of the human being does each have, and are they commensurate? So let us turn to the ethical issues first. Certain scholars in the field of ethics have sought to divide what might be considered acceptable medical practices and technologies from unacceptable ones. In disentangling the ethical use of certain technologies from unethical uses, a common distinction is often invoked, that of therapy versus enhancement. Well, the medical field traditionally concerns itself with therapeutic procedures. One finds that health insurance companies will cover necessary surgeries, medicines, and other medical procedures if it is meant to cure, combat, or even prevent sickness and disease. For instance, a doctor would likely be reimbursed by a health insurance company for performing plastic surgery on a deformed patient who has had a skin disease. However, it is unlikely the same doctor would be reimbursed to perform the exact procedure for someone wanting a facelift. The difference is that the former scenario is intended for therapeutic purposes, whereas the latter is not. Well, as you can imagine, definitions are important here. So there are several definitions of therapy that get used in the field. The term itself is derived from Greek and literally means curing or healing. The President's Council for Bioethics, this is the President of the United States, defines therapy as a treatment for a disorder or deficiency which aims to bring an unhealthy person to health. Alan Buchanan offers a far simpler definition, describing it as the treatment or prevention of diseases, and another leading bioethicist, Eric Jungst, defines it as treatments aimed at pathologies that compromise health or reduce one's level of functioning below this species-typical or statistically normal level. What can be gleaned from these definitions is, one, therapy depends upon how we define health, right? And two, the aim or intention of applying a therapy is to treat a disease or malady. In other words, the malady causes the individual to experience a loss of normal health, and the treatment or therapy aims to bring the health back to the individual. Much then depends upon how we define health. Well, some have tried to define it negatively, saying health is the absence of sickness, right, or disease. However, the World Health Organization defines health positively by saying it is, quote, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. But as with most things, it is the details and how one quantifies it that makes the difference, especially in the context of trying to delineate between therapy and enhancement. For one could argue certain enhancements promote health in that they contribute to the individual's state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So this is where I think Jungst's definition is more precise and helpful. I have it just down here on the bottom, repeated. It implicitly defines health in a more quantitative way, appealing to what we ought to expect from a typical member in the human species or from a particular group or society. In this way, health is not just a qualitative category freely defined by a certain individual, but it's rather an expectation of the human species or particular society. This contention is important because it recognizes that health need not be one thing or one acceptable metric, but represents a band, a gradient, within which each member of the human species, although different, can be said to be healthy. For example, not everyone has the same level of strength. We wouldn't expect a relatively small elderly woman to have the same strength of a male bodybuilder in his prime. Health represents this gradient or continuum of expected metric within a particular society or species for a given stage of development. Enhancement, on the other hand, purports not only to apply medical procedures and technologies to a human being to raise them to health. Enhancement aims to make the individual better than good. There are many definitions of enhancement. Julian Savulescu, as a applied ethicist at Oxford, defines enhancement as any change in biology or psychology of a person which increases the chances of leading a good life in a relevant set of circumstances. And the President's Council for Bioethics defines it as an improvement or extension of some characteristic, capacity, or activity. However, these definitions could just as well describe therapy. More specific definitions, I think, are called for. And this is where I think Norm Daniels and Alan Buchanan's definition are more precise. Daniels claims an enhancement is about boosting our capabilities beyond the species-typical level or statistically normal range of functioning for an individual. So we see that here. And Buchanan states an enhancement is an intervention, a human action of any kind that improves some capacity or characteristic that normal human beings ordinarily have, or more radically, that produces a new one. Here, as we saw with therapy, these definitions acknowledge that normative distribution of capacities in a particular society, whereas therapy improves to health, enhancement improves from health. Well, in practice, it is not as simple to delineate between enhancement and therapy. First, trying to say that certain technologies are clearly enhancement technologies, while others are not, are only therapeutic. It just can't be done if one looks at the process or the technique alone. For instance, caffeine can be used to combat migraine headaches, in which case it can be therapeutic, right? It brings the individual back to health and the norm of not having a headache. But it can also be helped to focus people and improve their mental performance, as I'm hoping many of you have just had in your coffee break. The process of taking the caffeine alone can't help us to distinguish whether it is an enhancement technology or therapeutic. Therapy and enhancements cannot be distinguished by their means, but by their ends. Well, second, some therapies can also lead to unintended enhancements or enhancements in unintended areas. For instance, metabolic steroids might be prescribed to a patient in a wheelchair to strengthen their arms, to help them, navigate tough terrain or something like that. So the initial aim of the steroids is therapeutic, right? It allows the person to be as mobile as the average person. However, it could lead to an enhancement in unintended areas outside of the wheelchair use. For example, the patient might be able to lift more or start a chainsaw with a greater ease than the average person. In a similar way, a therapy might unintentionally turn into an enhancement. Consider the case of the South African sprinter down here, Oscar Pistorius, who's been in the news quite a bit in the last few years. Well, both of Pistorius' legs, if you don't know his situation, both of his legs were amputated as a child. And he was given advanced prosthetic limbs. Well, in 2007, Dr. Peter Brueggemann concluded after extensive testing that Pistorius' limbs used 25% less energy than runners with complete natural legs to run at the same speed, and that they led to less vertical motion combined with 30% less mechanical work for lifting the body. So a clear advantage, enhancement over natural legs. So this led to sport officials banning Pistorius from taking part in the 2008 Olympics because the prosthetics gave him an unfair advantage. Here we see an example where a medical procedure was intended for a therapeutic purpose, but ended up becoming an enhancement in a particular domain. And finally, the boundary between therapy and enhancement is a moving target. If we accept that health is best defined by an acceptable gradient within society, then this distinction is already fairly nebulous. Two issues illustrate how this distinction might not be as useful as it is implied. First, the standard of health shifts from context to context. What might have been an acceptable duty of care during the First World War, or in sub-Saharan Africa today, presupposes a standard of health that would be different than it is today, or in other parts of the world. In other words, the boundaries of acceptable health have shifted. What might have been an enhancement in the past, or even in parts of the globe, might now be a therapy. What is more, if we allow enhancements in the general populace, this will continue to change the target of health, and possibly at a much more advanced rate. Second, in the case of an individual who's at the bottom threshold of a measure of health and wants to apply a medical procedure to be at the top of this threshold, how do we define this procedure? Is that an enhancement? Is that a therapy? They are being brought to within the standard of health and might argue that they are not well compared to others at the top and experience a serious disadvantage because of this. However, they would have originally been classified as healthy and subsequently improved their condition. So classification of this sort can often be difficult. Well, the distinction between therapy and enhancement is of limited value when considering the moral implications of advancing medical technologies. Often the discussion is more rhetorical than substantive when it's brought up. A common motivation behind the appeal to enhancement therapy distinction is that therapies are inherently good, while enhancements are, at the very least, suspect, if not altogether immoral. Yet there are examples of clear enhancements that are acceptable in society and even sanctioned and supported by health professionals, such as vaccines. Most ethicists seek a moral compass elsewhere to guide them, through the murky waters of biotechnology and enhancement in this distinction. So I'm going to turn to some arguments for and against enhancement. Let's look at some arguments for enhancement first. Well, the first argument might seem relatively obvious, and it's grounded in the kind of positive connotations of the term enhancement. If an enhancement makes the quality of one's life better, why would you want to limit this for everyone? Indeed, it invokes a common argument for enhancement on the grounds of liberty. Each person should be able to choose whatever means possible to help them lead a good life, however they define that. So this appeal to liberty often takes a radical form in its corresponding imperative that one ought to shape themselves in any way that they can. Here, a passive acknowledgement of the inherent good of self-direction is amplified to a moral imperative announcing at times that the human being is nothing less than a will that creates itself, and any means of self-transformation is called for. One need not invoke such an extreme maxim here, though, to acknowledge a similar line of reasoning already used in non-biomedical applications related to enhancement. For instance, we encourage our children to stay in school, believing a good education will give them greater opportunities and an enhanced set of possibilities later in life. In our modern age, where freedom and choice are proclaimed virtues in themselves, people who support this argument ask why we should limit liberty and self-transformation to solely non-biomedical means. Indeed, the consistency or boundary placing argument is often used to support enhancement. So proponents of this position say something like this, that if the boundary between acceptable therapies or enhancements and unacceptable enhancements is a moving target and inherently fuzzy, then any demarcation will be entirely arbitrary. For example, they might say, what's the difference between taking steroids to improve swimming performance and wearing a streamlined bathing suit? If a sufficient rational boundary cannot be established, they say, then enhancements ought to be allowed across the board. Well, the final position states that biomedical enhancement is inevitable, the inevitability argument. And thus, any strictures placed on it will inevitably fail. So this is more of a social argument, I guess, rather than one which relies upon a certain rational argument. So here the argument often rests on the inherent attraction of enhancements, that the enhancements will lead to outcomes of values, social forces, and incentives. So the wager is that people will invariably opt for enhancements because they're advantageous relative to the rest of the population. So there's a greater incentive to enhance for either the desire to be better than one's peers, keeping up the Joneses, so to speak, or to keep up for fear of falling behind. So they say any political sanctions made against enhancement will be thwarted by the social inevitability of their introduction. However, there are many arguments against the use of enhancement as well. So a rebuttal to the boundary placing arguments that I was just talking about prior often appeals to the difference the means make towards an end, in that they help cultivate certain praised virtues. So the issue with not providing limits to the uses of biotechnology is that they can potentially be used to undermine the meaning, the point, or the virtue of the action. For instance, a runner that takes steroids circumvents the point or value of a sport or running a race. The fans don't come just to see people move quickly, but we praise them for their hard work and the way in which that work means they perform well. The point and meaning of being an athlete running a race is undercut if all it takes is ingesting a pill. People that invoke this argument against enhancement use a moral reasoning largely defined by virtue ethics. Here, a good and moral life is dependent upon the expression of certain virtues that are reflected in moral actions. A virtue ethicist, Christian or otherwise, might argue that enhancements degrade the meaning of those virtues that help one lead a morally exemplary life, because those virtues have not been developed through discipline and hard work. In the case of the Christian tradition, moral character in conformity to the image of Christ is formed through spiritual disciplines such as prayer, study, silence, fasting. A Christian virtue ethicist might have difficulties if a pill could replace these disciplines, and the same behaviors or character were produced citing the means of attainment are central to our conformity to Christ. In a similar argument, these detractors might also worry about the character implicit in desiring, even the desiring to circumvent the labor needed to attain a certain virtue. Doesn't the supposed choice to take a pill rather than exercise longer or pray more actually reveal a stunted moral character in the beginning? Because they are unwilling to sacrifice time, energy, and part of themselves to attain this goal. What is more, these virtue ethicists might add, what kind of person lies behind this desire to manipulate the means to attain these virtues? They would argue that the desire to enhance actually reflects a tyrannical character that seeks to control and manipulates, rather than one that is humble and sacrificial, entirely antithetical to a moral life built upon by the virtues. One of the most significant worries about human enhancement is that it crosses a boundary that should never be crossed. In other words, human beings begin to play God when they tamper with genetic material, directly shape our body, and alter our basic human nature. For someone who does not subscribe to a particular faith tradition, this argument often appeals to what's called the wisdom of nature. A modern variant will argue that through thousands of years of evolution, a kind of harmonious and productive homeostasis has arisen within nature, such that we ought to, on the face of things, trust the interworkings of nature. Interjecting into and altering this order could lead to a destabilized natural system that could be disadvantageous or even disastrous. This could kind of be summed up by the pragmatic adage, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. The Christian use of this argument depends upon a deeper commitment than the secular counterpart. While the secular appeal to a wisdom of nature is based upon practical and instrumental concerns, playing God appeals to divinely ordained orders of creation. In this case, an infracture is not just practically dubious, but oversteps providential boundaries in extending the dominion of human beings and nature. Proponents of this position will often hold to some form of natural law. God's intentions and directions for human beings, other creatures, and the rest of creation are at least in part visible in the way God has created the world. Having been ordained by God, these natural laws are not meant to be broken, and doing so is an affront to the moral order. To say that enhancement is unnatural invokes a natural law given by God. For both of these appeals, Christians and non-Christians, or religious and non-religious, can cite the apparent brokenness of nature as a way to parry this playing God position. For instance, so the non-Christian or the non-religious person might say, well, evolution does not always lead to a peaceful homeostasis, but has developed natural systems that are disjointed with unnecessary parts and might produce something which is dysfunctional. There's no reason to see in evolution a wise creator, or at least wiser than what human beings could create through direct reflection and effort. For Christians, clearly we live in a fallen world that is in need of redemption. Predation, sin, and evil are a reality. And this hinders the good functioning of creation and society. Hence, these Christians might actually say we have a moral imperative to be co-creators with God in redeeming the world towards its divinely ordained telos and function. This position might advocate enhancement on Christian grounds, and they would see it as part of God's good plan in redeeming all of creation. A final argument against enhancement focuses on the social ramifications. Radical forms of this position point to the horrendous history of eugenics. In the early part of the 20th century, certain social Darwinists advocated selectively altering the gene pool towards its improvement. It was largely based on a dubious classification of races, and was used as a basis to commit such atrocities as the Holocaust. More modern variants, though, contend that the introduction of enhancements into society will exacerbate already existing socioeconomic inequality. Given the current state of medical access, it is the affluent that are able to take advantage of cutting-edge technology and procedures for the simple reason that they are often more costly than well-established practices. The fear is that the rich will be able to have access to these enhancements first, which would then give them a serious advantage in society, causing greater social stratification than currently exists. Therefore, they recommend enhancements ought to be banned or at least heavily restricted. Well, as we have seen in this section of the presentation, the ethics of human enhancement is anything but straightforward. What is more, when turning to typical Christian responses and other religious responses to human enhancement, often believers might come down on opposing positions for specifically theological and ethical reasons. Indeed, it is often the commitments one has coming to the issue, ethical or denominational, theological, that will dictate the response one might have to enhancement. A typical Roman Catholic response will rely upon natural law. It will often be much more conservative in their use of biomedicine and enhancement technologies. More liberal Christians, in parts of, let's say, the Anglican Communion or forms of Methodism, might see God's handiwork in and through these enhancements, and actually be a source of praise for God's redeeming of creation through it. As both Ted Peters and Ronald Cole Turner note, it is often our overall view of creation that will largely affect our stance on enhancement. If we only see creation as good, we tend to overestimate our goodness, i.e. our powers, the reason, or to know what God wants, or we find it hard to name defects in nature that should be corrected. However, if we see creation only as flawed or fallen, we then assume that it is open to any and all manipulations, and we fail to see that it has value independent of us. So a lot of this largely depends upon what your theological presuppositions tend to be. However we decide to respond to enhancement as Christians and other religious peoples, we ought to think seriously about these issues, because they're becoming more pronounced over time, and do not look as if they will be going away anytime soon. Even if genetic enhancement is possible from a Christian and religious point of view, when we turn to transhumanism, we find something of far greater concern. Transhumanism does not simply rely upon human enhancement, but rather creates an ideology from it, one that stands, I argue, in distinction to traditional Christian views of the human being. So let's turn to transhumanism. As we have seen, much of the ethics involved with human enhancement appealed either explicitly or implicitly to a particular vision of being human. In the rest of our time together, I want to focus on the anthropological issues at play when Christians engage the ideology of human enhancement, transhumanism. But before turning to these anthropological issues directly, let me introduce transhumanism itself. Nick Bostrom, one of the lead philosophical gatekeepers of contemporary transhumanism, defines it this way. It's the intellectual and cultural movement that affirms the possibility and desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available technologies to eliminate aging and to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. So that's the first part of the definition. The second is it's also the study of the ramifications, the promises, and potential dangers of technologies that will enable us to overcome fundamental human limitations, and the related study of the ethical matters involved in developing and using such technologies. Well, transhumanism is related to humanism, and both share many of the same values and convictions. Both are committed to human progress, rational thinking, and the flourishing of the human species as goods in themselves. But whereas humanism sets its task of improving the human condition through education and art, politics, and other cultural means, transhumanism applies this directly to the human organism and promotes the acceleration of human evolution through the intentional modification and enhancement of the human species by utilizing growing technologies such as nanotechnology, biotechnology, and information technology. Transhumanism contends that human beings are in the process of becoming, and we're at a watershed moment. At no other time in history did we have such power over our own development and drastically affect the course of human history in each individual self. They say we ought to seize that opportunity and use any means necessary to enhance ourselves for the betterment of individual selves, our societies, and our species. Well, what kind of anthropology does transhumanism promulgate? I contend that transhumanism has three central beliefs about being human. First, the human is mind and rationality. Second, the human is information. And third, the human is freedom and will. Let me unpack each of these in turn. So, transhumanism and the human as mind and rationality. Well, Aristotle famously defined the human being as a rational animal. Humanity is a creature and in the company of other animals, but is distinct in its rationality and ability to reason. The Enlightenment and subsequently the modern period accentuated this Aristotelian maxim, so that the human being was raised above the other animals precisely when it was utilizing its reasoning powers. Philosophical treatises by Leibniz, Spinoza, and Kant sought to understand the primary purpose, function, and limit of this supreme humanistic virtue, rationality. Transhumanism shares in this rationalist philosophy, and as an heir, locates what is distinctive about the human being in the mind and its power and organization. For the transhumanist, it is the intellect that makes humanity great. Transhumanism radicalizes the rationalist position and claims the only thing that is most essential to the human being exists in the patterns and makeup of each individual's brain. The mind is merely the manifestation of complex matter and the unique setup housed in our neural networks. Our memories, our intellect, and our personalities are solely products of interactions between neurons. Because of this, our embodied existences are only an historical and contingent coincidence. Sure, we might need our bodies for input to our brains at present and to provide nutrients to it, but there is nothing essential about our bodies that could not be abandoned if other suitable means were found. This is what they say. Indeed, this is precisely what transhumanists recommend. Many say the future of the human race is in what's called mind uploading, capturing the unique pattern of each person's neural network so that it can be transmitted to silicon-based hardware. Nick Bostrom, who I mentioned earlier, notes we ought to abandon our bodies for more durable media because, as he says, your body is a death trap. For transhumanism, the human being is nothing less than a disembodied mind made up of complex calculations and logic. So the second component of the transhumanist anthropology is that transhumanism, that the human is information. When transhumanists advocates that human being, or what is really important with human being, is captured in our brains and minds and easily transferred to whatever medium is necessary, they're really just saying that the human being is nothing more than information. The human being can be reduced entirely to the representable, where the reality of lived existence is reduced to the symbolic representation of that lived existence. Of course, any contemporary treatise on human identity will take into consideration how our past experiences, history, and memory play a significant role in who we are as individual persons. The content of that history and the unique experiences captured in our memories is important to understanding the identity of each person and what defines human beings. However, transhumanists contends that the person is nothing but that which can be represented in information. This basic anthropological tenet is manifest in two very concrete features of transhumanism. First, before mind uploading is technically feasible or possible, transhumanists advocate human beings should retrofit their current bodies with advanced computer hardware and utilize any and all enhancements to become, in the process, a veritable cyborg. In this move, we see one of their most central convictions regarding being human: the lack of distinction between that which is natural and given and that which is artificial and created. Transhumanists see no significant ontological distinction between the two. This can be held because they adhere to what's called an ontology of information. In other words, the idea that the essence of anything is to be found in its corresponding representation in information. Both can be reduced to a corresponding set of zeros and ones. Therefore, because they see no difference between the human body and any other objects, because everything is reducible to information, they not only have no problem with artificial retrofitting of the body, but they even advocate it. Transhumanism invokes an ontology of information where the virtual is more basic and primordial than the real. The second feature which uncovers this ontology of information is related to their stance on artificial intelligence and the Turing test. This is quite a funny comment here. Yesterday I made a Turing test. Interesting, what was the result? I failed. The machine realized immediately that it was me being the dumb human. Well, the Turing test measures whether artificial intelligence can think. Recent philosophical work on the Turing test is interpreted by many transhumanists as a signal that we do indeed have the possibility of thinking artificial intelligences. This test paves the way for transhumanists to take up the extra leap beyond this and to make room for purely artificial life forms that are self-directed and enjoy many of the privileges of other persons. Well, despite how strange this might sound to you, what it exposes is once again how transhumanism depends upon an ontology of information. If a human being is nothing but its neural network and corresponding intelligence, where the medium does not matter, then why shouldn't a purely crafted and programmed artificial intelligence also fit their standard for what constitutes a person? The human being is like everything else, primarily made up of information. Well, in the last section, so let's move on to the third component of transhumanist anthropology, that of the human as freedom and will. In the last section, we saw that certain appeals to human enhancements depended upon recognizing that freedom of choice was one of the supreme virtues in our modern age. Proponents of human enhancement, such as found in transhumanism, rely upon the inherent virtue recognized in being able to decide the fate and course of our actions. Our political systems valorize individual human choice and are set up precisely to safeguard our rights towards self-direction. Well, transhumanism celebrates this freedom and indeed extends it to self-transformation of all kinds. Modernity has always been defined by a powerful subject that subdues its environment and takes control of its affairs. Since Francis Bacon, with increasing vigor through Nietzsche, to today's transhumanists, the will has been at the core of what defines human beings. This will to transform was first directed towards nature, external to us, where the individual's dominion was a direct product of the will's influence. But with the arrival of Nietzsche and other existentialists came a turning of the will inwards as well as outwards. The very notion of personhood and identity became more flexible and fluid in postmodernity, but with no less emphasis on the will as the inscrutable center of humanity. Brent Waters, in his book, does a really good job of kind of outlining the philosophical and theological tenets of posthumanism on this very topic of the flexibility of identity. For the postmodernists, the aim of life's game is constant transformation and reinvention of oneself. In this world, the environment and the players are never stand still. Transhumanism is but the extension of this crowning postmodernist philosophy, built on modernist soil, taken to new logical extremes. Well, I think it's important to note that many of these anthropological convictions are not only visible in transhumanism. Other germinal instantiations are invoked by our prevailing society today, and by more sober advocates of human enhancement. For instance, we understand today how important psychology is to human identity, and that people's actions are dictated by certain reasons, rationality that they give to these actions. People are genuinely rational and self-directed. Furthermore, the increasing rights given to corporations as virtual persons in politics today shows we're willing to accept that personhood is a continuum and can be bestowed to non-biological entities, as these transhumanists do. And the rise of identity fraud and arguments over intellectual property also reveals how closely we associate information about ourselves with who we are, and that our information and the things we create are somehow part of us and not to be manipulated without our consent. So information is important for our very personhood. And what is more, in terms of the will and freedom, we laud the likes of people who can overcome the odds of their upbringing to make something of themselves, showing how important resolve and a strong will are to becoming human. So the claims of transhumanist anthropology bear many remarkable similarities to less zealous and more popular contemporary anthropologies today. Let's now transition to what Christians think about the human being. What do Christians say about being human, and is it very different from the anthropology of transhumanism? Well, first, Christians understand that the human being is a creature. As human beings, we owe our existence to God, who is the creator of all that is. Our source of existence and life is thoroughly derived from the utter gratuity and freedom of God to create abundantly. The entire concept of creature evokes dependency upon a creator. We have been created contingent, limited, fragile. We need food, water, and air to survive, and hence our dependency extends not only and primarily to God, but to the rest of creation as well. Indeed, we are not alone as creatures, but in a much larger fellowship of creation. The first two chapters of Genesis place human beings in this created order, and as such, we are imago mundi. We are in the image of the world. However, human beings are distinct from the rest of creation as imago Dei, in the image of God. It is clear from the Christian scriptures and tradition, we have been gifted and set apart in some ways as bearers of God's divine image. Some interpret this image as a divine task, to be God's stewards in the world and to look after his creation through cultivation and divine representation, so the functional account. So in this one it says that it's our special purpose in creation to be God's representative and to help bring his creation to fruition that defines this image. Others have said, holding to a substantialist interpretation of the Imago Dei, that certain features inherent in human beings, such as rationality or volition, are the seat of the image of God. And that's what makes us unique in like God. More recent views don't look at each individual human, but to their inherent relationality with others and to God to define this image. Taking a relational view of the Imago Dei means locating the divine image in fellowship. While different Christian traditions across history emphasize different aspects of each of these views, all agree that the fullest image of God, and indeed all interpretations of the image of God, ought to be grounded in the person of Christ. So if we want to understand what it means to be human, we need to look to Christ. Since Christ is God in human form, we will find in the incarnation the supreme image of God, the very thing which makes human beings unique. It is clear the New Testament bears witness to Christ being the fullest image. It often links this explicitly, for example, in 2 Corinthians. However, the concept of the image of God is also explicitly linked to God's glory, where Christ is the very glory of God, as we see in John 1:14. And indeed, Pauline Christology in the Gospel of John constantly link Christ to the already established sister concept of God's glory and image found in the Old Testament. What is of grave importance here is then how the rest of humanity relates to Christ relative to this image. It is here we are told we are in the process of being conformed to the image of Christ. We poorly reflect God's glory in today, but insofar as we live in relation to Christ and reflect his glory by following him, reflecting the fruits of the Spirit, we too reflect the glory of God with Christ. In this way, the image of God takes on a thoroughly dynamic and eschatological character, as we saw with Professor Southgate's presentation yesterday. So it takes on a thoroughly dynamic and eschatological character where our adoption as children of God in Christ takes on its most important significance. For our conformity to Christ also means we share in his glory and resurrection at the end of all time. The telos, the end of human beings as image bearer, is in a glorified Christ that reflects God's glory in a thoroughly redeemed creation. How does a Christian understanding of human being cohere with the transhumanist vision? Several items look similar. Depending on one's interpretation of the image of God, both can share in the conviction that certain features, such as rationality or volition, are key to being human. Additionally, both contend that human being is bound for better things, and that we are in a process of transformation today. However, the overall vision and the final aim of humanity, I argue, is different. Transhumanism is just the human writ large. It is but an extension or logical conclusion of the human as mind, rationality, information, and will. While the contemporary Christian anthropology might acknowledge these aspects as integral to being human, they are not ends in themselves. They are only good insofar as they can be used to reflect God's glory as image bearers. What is more, that final ideal image is not some androgynous human prototype, but Christ himself. Christians believe a true human being, what a human ought to be and is becoming, is only possible in relation to God in Christ. No amount of enhancements will be able to contend with the reality of sin that has destroyed and marred the human. Only Christ can redeem and bring to fruition the real human. Now to some conclusions. Well, it's clear that the issues involved with human enhancement and transhumanism are significant and pressing in our day. We will continue to be faced with ever more difficult decisions in the doctor's office as biotechnology advances and society grapples with what ought to be considered proper medical practice and what is beyond the bounds of acceptable therapies. Indeed, the spectrum of Christian and other ethical responses to these new dilemmas is really at the beginning stages of grappling with the growing technology in this area. And it is diverse and varied. It's still relatively germinal. Indeed, this technology is having us ask some of the most fundamental questions. What is a good life? What is the aim of being human? And what does the future hold? How does being a Christian and or religious make a difference to how I approach human enhancement and transhumanism? So these are all very much working questions, I think, for all of us. Well, let me end with a kind of promotion of why studying transhumanism and being aware of it is important. Well, as a system of belief, I think it has a high likelihood of catching on in an increasingly technological, scientifically informed, and secular public. Past secular ideologies such as humanism and Marxism are likely to be eclipsed for precisely the reason that transhumanism incorporates many religiously motivated features in response to those pressing existential questions posed above. Transhumanism offers answers to what is going to happen to us and the planet in the future, and how can we safeguard what is meaningful for our progeny? What about our individual deaths? What about transcending ourselves and growing better? What can I really hope for and in? What is more, transhumanism encloses these answers in a robust narrative with a strong footing in science and atheism at times. Religious people everywhere ought to recognize transhumanism as the shape of things to come and know how to respond to it effectively and faithfully. Well, here are some resources as a kind of final thing that I believe you probably have access to. I sent them ahead beforehand. But, oh good, so they're in the handouts. But, so here are some texts to look through if you want to look at these issues further. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that talk, and I'm sure that's led to many questions and discussion. We'll stand at the back and work forward, I think. Yes, so that's what that's right in the back. Back row, please. Yeah, and then we'll get and work forward. Just so people know. Get your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was lovely. You talked about the social ramification argument. I'm thinking about brain enhancement, neuro drugs that people use, and I wonder where society plays a role in this. So, for example, we've got surgeons taking drugs instead of drinking coffee because they do 12-hour shifts. Is it better to have a surgeon taking drugs rather than a shaky hand because they're tired? I'm sure we have Cambridge University students enhancing their brains to take exams. Whose moral responsibility is it for us to take this step back? Do we need to change working hours? Do we need to change people's perception of what a human is? Can I ask you a Christian perspective on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the reasons why talks of this nature are so important is because leaving these issues to the practitioners of those very things isn't sufficient. It affects all of us in society, right? I mean, in the same kind of way that producing new technologies or new sciences, the kind of social ramifications are very important. I think this is why the whole idea of health as a public health is incredibly important, and that we all need to be reflecting upon that and asking our MP, have you thought about this or read about this, and taking a stand one or the other. So it's not just an individual thing, because you're right. Doctors coming in after a third night shift, about to perform a surgery. I surely wouldn't want that person, to be operating on me when it comes down to it. And so I think we need to be much more engaged, absolutely, with the effects it has in putting necessary kinds of laws and strictures and things like that in place.
Yes,
Thank you, Michael, so much. I'm just struggling still with the idea of what human enhancement is. And I'm wondering how much it's reliant on what we're used to. So just as sort of case studies, you know, is a universally practiced technology like cooking food a human enhancement? Or is it limited to things that fewer people have access to? Would something like driving a car be considered human enhancement?
Absolutely. I mean, as you saw in basically the entire first part of the presentation, I looked at how people have been trying to delineate, right, between therapies and enhancements. And I think that's really difficult to do, whether we make it something which is kind of qualitative. But it's one of these kind of things. I was just talking with a medical doctor a few days ago, and he said it's a bit like pornography. You know, I know it when I see it, you know, kind of thing. You know, but it's difficult when you want to actually, you know, pass some of these laws where you actually have to sit down and say, you know, this particular practice or utilizing this technology in this way is much more difficult to, I think, nail down. And I think that's why Jung's definition on, if we are going to have a public understanding of what that is, aside from whatever our kind of background, religious, you know, perspectives or ideologies or what we adhere to, this idea of its relation to a species typical, developmental, societal expectation. So I think human enhancement is something that changes from society to age to age. And I think that's also one of their worries about it, right? Is if we're not thinking about this trajectory, then, you know, we're taking a path that we are not reflecting upon. If all we're doing is looking at in the present. So that's where the anthropological questions, I think, really need to play a much larger role in understanding what really is enhancement, or what's the ends, and are we enhancing in the right ways? Is it enhancement, or is it, you know, degradation or something like this? So I think that's what the more anthropological questions are really important.
Okay, we're coming forward now. We'll go to the back again, but Rodney and then we'll come on to it. So, yes.
Thank you very much. I think there is a theological issue of the common good, which I think you hinted at with, you know, the affluent are going to be the ones who benefit from all this and so on. But even more narrowly than that, it seems to me that students taking drugs in exams, they get an advantage over other students who don't do that. The ones who take steroids in athletics are the ones who get the advantage. And if that becomes the norm, if it becomes legalized, then there's a question of fairness, and people may not want to take steroids. After all, there are dangerous side effects of taking steroids, which, I mean, you know, we're living in a kind of idealistic world in some ways and thinking that this enhancement is all good, you know, but taking these things has its bad effects as well, and people are going to be forced into doing that.
Well, and it's interesting, right, that oftentimes, because people would want to have a certain advantage, I mean, even with prescription drugs, you know, that are for a certain therapy, we're willing to utilize certain drugs for an intended purpose, even if there are certain kinds of poor side effects. You know, so it's kind of endemic into this, well, you know what, if this, you know, if taking caffeine or a certain kind of drug will help me focus, you know, in the short term, and help me to, you know, pass a test much easier, but, you know, I might have, you know, 7 or 8 hours later when I'm crashing and I have a huge headache. It's, you know, what are we willing to sacrifice? And it's interesting how then, what are the social ramifications of that kind of thinking, you know, in it as well? The kinds of, are we going to be willing to do more hazardous things? And what does then that mean, right? With the doctor and, you know, who's about to perform a surgery, or, you know, a nurse that's been on, you know, night shift for 3 nights and is about to drive a car. So it's, I mean, having that edge over somebody else, you know, in society, or certain kinds of things, or our ability, at what sacrifice? And I think that's a huge, huge issue, because, and the interesting thing is, you might get certain proponents of transhumanism saying, that's fine, I'm not advocating we use things with, you know, really, really risky side effects. But there might be certain things that the enhancement far outweighs. The utilitarian calculus is much better swung away. And what do we do about those kinds of things?
Question here? Okay. Oh, okay, we'll go there and then sorry. Brilliant, that's fine. Okay. Everyone will get a chance. Yeah.
Kind of a similar question. Not just enhancements, but treatments in the past have been much more accessible to people who are wealthy, from the TB syphilis project all the way through people in the United States being denied health insurance for pre-existing conditions. How do we ensure in the future that enhancements or even just therapies are equally accessible to everyone?
That's a great question.
I'm a national health officer.
I mean, I think that's about right, because otherwise you don't have a really robust public health.
Yeah.
Because then it's localized to a particular area, the jurisdiction is a certain area, in an increasing globalized world. And that might be fine if you're in southern Georgia and you never leave, that certain society. But if you're not going to get on an airplane and go to Seattle, that might have a different standard of healthcare. In which case, you do need larger things like the public health organization, things like that, to really deal with it. And I think to really decide quicker. I mean, this is always one of the huge issues, is the discrepancy in timing between the technologies coming out and then their regulation or understanding the side effects. And this is where it's really difficult to manage it, because it's just the pace of things happen. It's here, and if we don't regulate it here, perhaps somewhere in China might end up utilizing it for this kind of thing. So this is where I think having these international organizations is absolutely imperative this day and age.
Question here? Lizzie? Question here? Thank you.
If I look around the room, I see that every single woman here has made a hole in her ear and put an earring. Now, this is enhancement. They weren't ill without this hole, and no one thinks that there's anything wrong with it. And men do the same. Now, then you go into plastic surgery to change the shape or the size of certain organs of the body. In fact, from a Jewish point of view, there is nothing wrong with this type of enhancement. But then we can go to pills, Prozac. I mean, if I take Prozac, I feel good. I like to feel good. I don't understand what should be wrong with that. What's the difference if I feel good by hearing marvelous lectures at the Faraday Institute, or by taking a pill? I mean, it's difficult for me to understand what exactly was wrong with enhancement.
Well, and so this is where the anthropological question: enhancement towards what end?
It makes me feel it's my free will to decide. So you to tell me what I want to do.
because of the choices that you make affect everybody else. And I think that's the difference. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's for precisely the reasons that we've just been discussing.
Her earring makes her more attractive to me now.
Yeah. I mean, so I think we can't look at just the certain ethical issues, but the ethical issues are important. But if we're going to really decide what it means for each one of these enhancements along the way, then you have to invoke towards what end. Why is it a good for you to put earrings in your ear?
That's my decision, not yours.
But I mean, but you presumably have some kind of understanding that beauty is a good thing, or perhaps that beauty is a good in the Jewish tradition, something like this. In which case, then your own faith is beholden to no man's an island when it comes down to this. She always asks the same question.
Yes.
That's kind of a comment on both your questions. So I was thinking about yesterday with Simon's talk and Neanderthals, if they had access to enhancement, where would humans be now? But likewise, he showed hugely the convergence of evolution. So it makes me think about because you can genetically change and modify embryos now, what is the future of humanity? Where are we evolving to? And so if we can genetically modify embryos, only the wealthy have access to this. How does this change how humans now look? I don't know, it's maybe sure if you have any reflections about where we're headed and what humans are going to be like.
That's a very good question, and part of the imperative in me wanting to really bring out these discussions isn't just because of the discrete moments that you're in the doctor's office and have to make a decision, but because of how radical and even the kind of way in which evolution can possibly change, right? So what are the past mechanisms that have led to perhaps cooperation, struggle with physics, etc. But we're at the point now where we can actually change and winnow the underlying genetic material. So we have direct access. The new CRISPR technology that people are just raving about in the last year, where it's cheaper than anything's been, it's more effective than anything's ever been. This is CRISPR technology, so it's technology that can go in and change parts of the DNA. It's more universal, so you can do it in a bear, that's effective in a bear, or a human being, or a tree. And it's precise, and it's cheap. So what are these technologies that are going to then transform? And a lot of the ethics around that right now is on what's our responsibility then to subsequent generations, right? That if we can affect things as basic as genetics, one of the things, the main argument against it now is that we don't have the person there to ask whether we can change it. So that's why we can't change embryos cells. But it doesn't mean that it can't change yourself. We're using this as kind of gene therapy.
Can I just add one point to that, maybe a reflection? I mean, I think we now know also that apart from medical genetics, which is a different field, but in terms of the range of behavioral genetics, that the genome is its own best defense. So whatever characteristic you look at in behavioral genetics, and you look at the heritability, whatever you pick out as a genetic variant that might contribute to that, I mean, it's usually its contribution to the variation in the population is usually less than 0.1%, if you're lucky. So in other words, the whole idea that you can somehow simply manipulate the genome to make people more intelligent or more generous or something is complete nonsense. Let's just understand that. So I think that's an important point to make, and I think some of the transhumanists really have no knowledge of genetics. I mean, they're just living in cloud cuckoo land. A lot of the stuff they come up with, frankly. So they just don't know their genetics. Hillary had a question, I think so.
I'd like to bring it back to some of the social consequences. You were talking about enhancing as a surgeon or a university student, but of course we live in the West in a society where women in particular seek to enhance their physical appearance, and there's enormous pressure on younger women to follow and conform in their body image to a particular shape or size and whatever. And of course that's I think that's possibly going beyond the autonomy of the free will, that it becomes something that's more controlling. I wonder if you have comments on that.
So you think then the social pressure?
Well, I'm thinking about the social pressure to enhance oneself, to conform to a particular kind of a model that is perhaps imposed upon people by other people, by the fashion industry or whatever, media and so on.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting about that, right, is, and I keep going back to this, but it presupposes that there's a certain vision, right, of what it means to then be a woman in society. And that woman in society presupposes a certain good of what a human being ought to be, right? And so society makes these kinds of judgments, or there's certain kinds of pressures where maybe the fashion industry, right, might have a larger voice, trying to influence you to say, you know what, a human being is this, that or being a woman as a human being is this. So I think being aware of the anthropological, what's the vision of what they want you to go with, So, and this is very clear, when you watch commercials and things like that of all kinds, and it's very blatant, and it's forcing you, not forcing, but it's definitely coercing you, pushing you in a certain way.
But when you're in silico, you won't worry too much about your body shape. Is that right? If you're a true transhumanists, then you would be wouldn't be worrying about such things. You're looking to the eschatological future.
Unless you get, various, spikes in voltage or something that's going to upset you or something.
Okay, we've got a question right at the back. Maybe just do full.
Thank you, Michael. That was very thought-provoking. Regardless of where Christians seem to fall on the issue of enhancement, we seem to be able to get behind and unite behind this idea of opposing transhumanism. So my question is, where would that line be drawn between enhancement and transhumanism?
Well, if I knew that, I wouldn't be studying it. That's essentially it. Sorry.
Why would you be studying that?
No.
I'm puzzled. What would you say?
So I think as a Christian myself, I think that there are divinely ordered, there are orders of creation. So I do feel that this playing God is a real concern of mine. But do I have an argument back to the transhumanists for them on non-Christian grounds? I think that's where I have a difficulty with it. Is I don't know if I necessarily do, because I think we have different understandings of what a good human being is.
Can I do a follow-up point or question on that? It's very interesting to me that the transhumanist ideology is mapped very precisely onto traditional Christian theology in a secular form, as Marxism is and was, of course. Because you have sin. What is the sin in transhumanism? It's not looking at, it's not really hoping for the future when you're going to be downloaded in silico. You've got to have an eschatological hope. So you have a fall. Your fallenness is you're willing to live in this present body which is no good. You should get rid of it. You should be Platonic. You should be a true follow Plato and put your brain in, as you've rightly pointed out. Then the salvation is technology. Salvation is technology, and you have an eschatological future, which sounds pretty lousy to me, where you're going to live in some computer. Your brains get, and a friend of ours, in the Institute in Oxford, is doing all this brain slicing, trying to get with the idea that you can just get enough slicing, you can download all this information in silico, which is presently completely fallacious. But anyway, but it's interesting, it does map onto Christian theology, don't you feel, as a theologian?
Well, not just Christian theology, but as a religious ideological movement. Absolutely. For all the reasons you just said, it's more than just a certain set of ethical boundaries, itself, but it really is a religious belief, I think, in many ways. People hope in it, they really do. And it's because it's dealing with things of ultimate concern, things dealing with death, the future, what can I mean in mind.
Okay, we'll take a few more questions, and we must have a very cool lunch. There's a lot of hands seen in the back, it's very vigorous. Can you pass the mic to the back row? Because I think here there's two questions there.
I'm particularly curious if there are any voices in this dialogue from non-Western societies, something more communally oriented, also from women. I saw there, Celia Dean Drummond is the one woman on your bibliography there, but this seems to be a dominant white male movement.
Absolutely, and I think because of all the anthropological considerations, right, which is will and freedom, information, things like this. So a great book of a female, a feminist theologian in North America called Janine Fluid Bates, who wrote a book called Cyborg Selves. And it's engaging not necessarily with transhumanism, but with other types of post-human visions. So where is the human going? And it's with its relation to technology and its understanding of itself. And so she actually thinks that there's a much more productive conversation to be had with people like Donna Haraway. That the issue of the cyborg, I guess, has this kind of foot in both worlds, and that it can be this how would you say that? It's a kind of social justice kind of thing. It tells us something about the kind of least of these. So her book, I think, is very good, and then it engages with things like disability theology, things like queer theology, which is very interesting. So she is definitely a light in a really modernist take, I think, on what the human being happens to be, and stuff that's very, very highly postmodern, and more needs to be reflected upon that side of it.
There was another question right at the back row. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to question whether or not sole improvement of the human is actually possible, or in enhancement, do we also enhance our fallenness, or that idea of fallenness, in maybe the same measure or to some degree? And if so, have we got this language right? Or is it more a case of, give man nuclear physics and he can make a power station or an atom bomb? And thus, should we take more care in talking about it solely being about improvement?
So there's been some interesting work by Ronald Poole Turner and Ted Peters on this. Can we enhance our morality? And I mean, surely we can affect our behaviors. When it comes to this, and think of, I don't know, I hate to use the example of science fiction, but Brave New World with Soma. I mean, the interesting thing there is it's, you have this perfectly ordered society, everybody loves each other, but they're all drugged, and the point behind it precisely is that we're meant to pity these people in some ways, right? Because they've gone about it the wrong way in some ways. There's right ways to become a more virtuous person, or in that kind of way. So I really agree with that we're just given bigger guns,
Yeah.
or our sphere of influence is much larger, I think. And it does. I think it does. It alters behavior, and sometimes you wonder, are we losing our freedom in that? Because it's at a moment's notice. We're completely changed, our neurophysiology. The means seems to make a difference on some of these things.
Can I just mention a scary article which I read recently? Came out in the Connecticut Law Review, well-known journal. But it was by a lawyer, or a student lawyer at least, reflecting on some genetic results, monoamine oxidase, high and low activity versions, and their prevalence in different populations and so on, and their supposed association with violence and their life. I won't go into the whole story, but the bottom line, which she was saying, this actually came up as a she about 4 or 5 years ago. Well, now we know this. Now we know, of course, it's a very dodgy result anyway, which is difficult to replicate, but now we know this. For the future health and wealth of the United States, we should make this prenatal diagnosis, pre-implantation diagnosis, and we should weed out these people with this, this particular genetic isoform, this variant, and we will lower the violence a lot in North America. And isn't that a good thing to do? Isn't that a good thing to do? We should do that. Of course, she failed to recognize that 70% of the Chinese population carry this particular variant. So there's a few little things she didn't quite get into there, but by just making the point, that this is a serious article, and arguing legally it should be mandated by every United States state that it should be forcibly put into process. This is, there you go. Sorry, this is it.
That's right.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know when lunch is sort of drawing us onwards and upwards. And I don't know if there was one more hand down. I don't want to cut it off too soon, but if there wasn't, then I probably killed off all discussion. Okay, so I think we really want to thank, we've worked our speaker again very hard indeed. So